Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day and welcome to Advocacy Anywhere, powered by American Jewish Committee. Advocacy Anywhere is AJC's digital platform that enables you to engage with AJC's global expertise, content, and advocacy from wherever you are. Earlier this month, Pew Research Center released its first new study of the American Jewish community since its inaugural 2013 survey. Included in this eagerly awaited study is an extensive chapter on the relationship of American Jews to Israel. We are delighted to be joined today, first by Dr. Becca Alper and Alan Cooperman of Pew Research Center, and then by Dr. Laura Shaw-Frank and Avi Meir from the American Jewish Committee for a deep dive into the survey. Following Becca and Alan's presentation and Laura and Avi's conversation, we will take your questions. You may email your question to questions@ajc.org, that's questions plural, or use the Q&A feature in Zoom. Becca and Alan, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today to hear about our new survey of Jewish Americans. Before we get into the data, just for those who are less familiar with our work, I need to first tell you a little bit about the Pew Research Center. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan, non-advocacy research center. We study religion because we think it's important, but not because we are promoting any particular religion or even religion in general. We never take policy positions and we don't make recommendations. Pew Research Center does not have any clients, we don't have any advertisers, and we don't sell anything to anyone. Everything we do is freely available on our website. Our funding comes primarily from the Pew Charitable Trust, which is our parent organization. For some particularly complex and costly projects, we also receive additional funding from individuals and foundations. And in the case of the 2020 study of Jewish Americans, like our 2013 study, the funding came from two sources, the Pew Charitable Trust and the Neubauer Family Foundation. The survey was conducted online and by mail using an ABS or address-based sample drawn from the United States Postal Service's national list of residential addresses, which include addresses from all 50 states and the District of Columbia. We did it this way because it's now the best way to do a nationally representative survey due to declining response rates to phone surveys. We got a much higher response rate by recruiting respondents by mail and asking them to take the survey online and on paper than we would have if we had done it again on the phone as we did in 2013. The report largely focuses on about 4,700 US adults who identify as Jewish. About 3,800 of them are Jews by religion, people who say their religion is Jewish and do not identify with any other religion, and nearly 900 respondents who are Jews of no religion. These are people who describe themselves religiously as atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular, but who have a Jewish parent or were raised Jewish, and who still consider themselves Jewish in some way today, such as ethnically, culturally, or because of their family background. So as I said, this survey is done differently than 2013 to see, to examine the impact of that. The part of the project was a mode experiment. We randomly assigned some people who were not part of the main study to be interviewed by phone, and we assigned others to answer the same questions online or by mail. And the result is that we found that a lot of our questions are not comparable because of this mode change. So we just ask that you keep that in mind as you hear us talk about those things and as you read the report yourself. So in 2012, when we designed the first Pew Research Center survey of Jewish Americans, our panel of expert advisors unanimously felt that anti-Semitism was not a pressing concern in the United States, and that we could go relatively light on the topic. This time around, in the wake of events in Charlottesville and Pittsburgh and other places, we devoted many more questions to aspects of anti-Semitism. To begin with, we find that 3/4 of US Jews surveyed said that there was more anti-Semitism in the US in 2020 than there had been 5 years earlier. And most of the rest said that the level was about the same. Just 5% said that it had declined from 5 years ago. You can also see in the lower bar, slightly more than half tell us that as a Jewish person in the United States, they personally feel less safe than they did 5 years earlier. Most of the rest say there has not been much change, and very few feel more safe. After this, we asked a follow-up question of those who said they feel less safe. The follow-up question was intended to measure how much of a chilling effect anti-Semitism has had on Jewish life. We asked those who feel less safe whether they have hesitated to participate in Jewish observances or events out of concern for their safety. And these percentages are based on all Jews. 35% feel less safe but have not hesitated to participate in any observances or events. 12% have hesitated but went ahead and participated anyways. And 5% of all Jews say they feel less safe, have hesitated, and did not participate in an observance or event out of concern for their safety. We also asked about a variety of concrete personal experiences with anti-Semitism, ranging in severity from having seen graffiti in your neighborhood to having been physically threatened or attacked. 37% of Jews report seeing anti-Jewish graffiti or vandalism in the past year. About 1 in 5 say they have been made to feel unwelcome. 15% have been called offensive names, and 1 in 10 or fewer have been harassed online or physically threatened or attacked. All told, 51% of US Jews report at least one of these 5 types of encounters over the past year. Now, I also want to point out a broad pattern in these data, which is that Orthodox Jews are more likely than other Jews to report having experiences like being called offensive names or being made to feel unwelcome or seeing graffiti or vandalism in their neighborhoods. Fully 75% of Orthodox Jews say they have experienced at least one of these in the past year. And we also see in the survey a possibly related phenomenon, which is that those who say they routinely wear something that is distinctively Jewish are more likely to report these kinds of experiences. 72% say they have experienced one of these in the past year. We also asked about common anti-Semitic stereotypes, taking care to differentiate whether respondents had heard these stereotypes voiced firsthand in their physical presence, or had heard or read about them secondhand, such as in the media or on the internet in the past year. 30% say they have heard firsthand someone say that Jews care too much about money. 9% say they've heard someone say that the Holocaust didn't happen or has been exaggerated. And 6% have heard the dual loyalty allegation that Jews care more about Israel than the United States. 1/3 of US Jews have heard at least one of these 3 tropes firsthand in the past year. That's all I'm covering for now. I'm going to hand you over to Alan, who's going to walk you through some findings and show you some age patterns we see in the data. Alan, you're up next.
Thank you, Becca. Would you go to the next slide, please? I'm going to show you some patterns by age. And to do this, I'm going to use what we call dot plots. And each dot represents an age group of American Jews. And this kind of a chart is particularly useful to see broad patterns. When the dots are close together, it means there aren't large differences by age. When the dots are far apart, it means that younger Jews and older Jews are very different on these measures. So first, just to note that when it comes to political party identification, younger Jews are very similar to older Jews overall, in that the vast majority, some 70% approximately, identify as Democratic, and about a quarter, or lean Democratic, and about a quarter identify as Republican, or are independents who say they lean toward the Republican Party. Next slide, please. I'm not sure, I'm not seeing my face. I'm still seeing Becca's face, but that's okay. My video does seem to be on, so I apologize for that. Maybe it'll come up now. Younger Jews are slightly more likely than older Jews. You see the dots are a little more spread apart to indicate that they are liberal as their political philosophy. overall, most Jews describe themselves as politically liberal or moderate. Next slide, please. For the most part, when we look at traditional measures of religious engagement, such as whether people say they fasted part or all of last Yom Kippur, whether they keep kosher, whether they held or participated in a Seder, how often they go to synagogue, and a broad kind of marker about whether they mark Shabbat or observe the Sabbath in a way that's personally meaningful to them, whether or not it's halachically sanctioned, but mark Shabbat in some way. We see actually that younger Jews are quite similar to older Jews on these measures. And I'll just note that this is different from the US public as a whole, where younger Americans on the whole are notably less religious in traditional ways than older Americans. Next slide, please. The survey also contained in 2020 a variety of measures of what one might think of as secular or cultural Jewish activities, things that aren't necessarily inherently religious, such as whether people cook or eat traditional Jewish foods, whether they visit Jewish historical sites when traveling, whether they read Jewish news online or listen to Jewish or Israeli music, whether they participate in online conversations about Judaism and so on. And some of these measures, such as watching TV, may be things that older people in general do more than younger people. But in overall, the interesting pattern here is that just as with traditional religious observances, younger Jews on the whole indicate levels of engagement with this wide variety of practices. There are actually about a dozen measures in the survey at roughly equal rates to older Jews. Next slide, please. Also, younger Jews are almost as likely as older Jews to have been to Israel. This is an extraordinary pattern in many respects, because if you think about it for even just a moment, older people have been on this planet longer. They've had more opportunities just in terms of time to have made a trip to Israel. And in general, older people may also have more financial means to make such a trip because of birthright and other programs, possibly at least in part. Younger Jews, Jews under the age of 50, are as likely as Jews in middle age and almost as likely as Jews over the age of 65 to have been to Israel. And many, in the younger category, just for interest, about a quarter have been on birthright trips, they tell us. Next slide. And yet, when we look at attitudes toward Israel, a variety of attitudes ranging from how much do you feel you have in common with Jews in Israel? Do you have a lot, some, not much, or nothing at all in common with Jews in Israel? Or how emotionally attached are you to Israel? Would you say you're very emotionally attached, somewhat emotionally attached, not too emotionally attached, or not at all emotionally attached to Israel? In these sorts of measures, unlike the measures that we've previously seen of Jewish traditional religious behavior, Jewish cultural behavior, here when it comes to Israel, we see actually quite substantial differences by age. And the general pattern being that on the measures of broad attachment or commonality with Israel, the younger Jews are less attached. When it comes to measures that are much more political, things like how people rate Netanyahu's leadership, young Jews are less likely to rate Netanyahu's leadership as excellent or good, and more likely to rate it as only fair or poor. They're somewhat less likely to strongly oppose, actually to have heard of the BDS movement and to strongly oppose it. And they are somewhat less likely to say that they believe that God gave the land of Israel, that is, that land that is now Israel, to the Jewish people. So on a variety of these measures, young Jews do look different from older Jews. Next slide, please. Similarly, when it comes to attitudes toward their grandchildren and what they would like for their grandchildren to do, we had 4 kind of questions about this. How important is it to you that your grandchildren, your putative grandchildren, someday in the future when you have grandchildren, if you don't yet, how important is it to you that they share your political convictions? How important is it to you that they be Jewish, that they carry on your family name, and that they marry someone who is Jewish? And young Jews are notably less likely than older Jews, in particular, to say it's important to them that their future grandchildren be Jewish and that they marry someone who is Jewish. Next slide, please. And we had a series of questions in which we asked Jewish Americans of all ages how much they feel they have in common with each other. That is, we asked about how much American Jews feel they have in common with Reform Jews, conservative Jews, Orthodox Jews. We asked this about a variety of Christian groups in the United States, Muslims in the United States, and we asked how much American Jews feel they have in common with Jews in Israel. And you'll note that younger Jews are somewhat less likely to say that they have a lot or some in common with Jews in Israel, and a bit more likely to say they have not much or particularly nothing at all in common with Jews in Israel. And that's the last of these slides. There is a great deal more information. We've only just skimmed the surface of what's in the survey. There are questions on many other topics, but what we wanted to do here is just tee up a couple of the broad patterns that we see, and hope that that might serve as a good fertile ground for the conversation that will follow. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you, Becca. I'd like to bring Avi and Laura on to dive a bit deeper into some of this data, but before transitioning to their conversation, going back to one of your last points, can you just explain why? Why is that the case that when it comes to Israel, you see such substantial differences by age?
Well, that is the $64,000 question, so to speak. And my simple answer is that I don't know. And I'm not just punting. I genuinely don't know. There's been a long debate about this. So let me just quickly say a couple of reasons why I don't know. One is that because of the methodological differences between this study and previous studies, it's very hard to create a baseline such that we could say that overall, the strength of US Jewish connections to Israel have declined, are stable, or have increased. It's just very hard for us to do that with any confidence. Secondly, kind of as a social scientist, one could look at these patterns of younger Jews being in many ways less connected or less attached to Israel than older Jews, and come and suggest at least 3 different explanations for why that might be the case. One set of explanations would be what social scientists call life cycle effects. And that simply is that during the course of someone's life, their views on things, their attitudes can change. And it may be that there's a broad pattern that as American Jews get older, they may tend on some issues to become more politically conservative and more attached or concerned about Israel. I will at least say that this is an argument that has been made by some observers over many years. There are whole books written about this. Second possibility is what social scientists think of as period effects. And that's a kind of a broad things that are going on in our society or in the entire world that affect public opinion on sort of across the board. A kind of an analogy just to think about this would be public opinion on same-sex and LGBTQ issues, where we've seen broad shifts across the public as a whole over the last 20-some years on these issues, but with a kind of the leading edge of this overall change being among younger folks. So you see broader differences between younger and older, even though kind of the whole society is moving in a particular direction. And the third possibility is what social scientists call true cohort or generational effects, where one generation, for one reason or another, because of the time that it comes of age, its particular formative experiences, the things that have gone on in their youth, has a different set of attitudes from previous generations. And it's also eminently possible that some of all of these things are taking place at once. And that's what makes it very difficult to use these data to kind of prove why it is that younger Jews are less attached or connected to Israel on a variety of measures. I do think that there's a lot more to be said about this, and AJC has two eminent observers ready to talk about it. So let me shut up and pass it along to Laura and Avi. And thank you very much for listening. Again, all the data that I shared are available on our website at pewresearch.org, a 250-page report that goes into detail. We'll find all the same numbers that Becca and I just presented. Thank you again.
So much, Alan, and thank you, Becca, for that illuminating overview of these really compelling findings. Laura, let's move over to you. You've actually delved into many of those 250 pages of data, and we're going to focus in this conversation about the relationship between American Jews and Israel. What's your mind are the top 3 takeaways on that issue?
So first of all, it's wonderful to be here. I feel very privileged and honored to be on a panel with the Pew folks, of course with Avi, my treasured colleague, but with the Pew folks, I'm a self-labeled Pew geek, and I do indeed delve into the study very deeply. I read the 2013 study many, many times, and working on catching up with the 2020 study as well. So I'm thrilled to be here. My 3 big takeaways. So the number 1 takeaway is the good news. American Jews are still very connected to Israel. 82% say caring about Israel is important or an essential piece of what being Jewish means to them. That's a pretty high number. 58% say that they're either very or somewhat emotionally attached to Israel. And that number seems significantly lower than caring about Israel. I think the reason it's so much lower is because I think caring is a lower bar than being emotionally attached, which sounds just more weighted. As Alan mentioned, 45% of US Jews have been to Israel. 26% of them have been there more than once. Again, as Alan mentioned, those numbers may seem low, particularly with respect to younger Jews. They don't have as much time to get to Israel, but also considering the cost, the distance, the foreignness of Israel to many American Jews, I think that number is impressive. So my number 1 takeaway is the news is good. But number 2, we have some significant weak spots. And those weak spots are really something that we need to examine, to worry about, to be concerned about, and to really think and strategize about how to address within the organized Jewish community. And Alan alluded to one of them in particular, which is the age that we see, particularly connection with Israel waning among younger Jews. And that's a real issue of concern. I have some theories of my own about why that is the case, and maybe we'll delve into those a little bit later when we talk at the end about what AJC can do. So that's one weak spot. And the other weak spot we see is denominationally. We see there's a very, very big gap between the connection of, for example, Orthodox Jews who tend to be more religiously observant, more traditionally observant, have more Jewish touch points in their daily lives. They are far more likely to be connected with Israel than liberal movement Jews as we move on to the left, or particularly Jews of no religion, who seem to have the weakest and least connected relationship to Israel. So we have to think as a Jewish community about how to strategize around those weak points and also, of course, the strong points. And the third thing I wanted to mention as a takeaway is kind of like it's about Israel, but it's also kind of a writ large point, which is I think that examining the American Jewish relationship with Israel actually highlights a number of divisions in the American Jewish community itself. So in some ways, I think that looking at the issue of Israel is kind of a way to take the temperature of the larger American Jewish community. So just to return to the points I was just making, it's interesting, right, with age that we see that younger Jews are actually quite Jewishly connected, but have a weaker connection to Israel. So that's something that we have to think about. Like that's a very, very telling thing for us. But denominationally, it's not that picture at all, meaning the connection to Israel tends to go along with connection to Judaism, a connection to Jewish practice, connection to Jewish ritual behavior, and Jewish traditional connections. And the third thing I would mention is political differences, which is very interesting. So Jews who identify as Republican are more likely to evince a closer connection to Israel than those who affiliate as Democrats. And that's interconnected with denominations, because Orthodox Jews are more likely to be Republican affiliated than liberal movement Jews, or Jews of no denomination, or Jews of no religion. So it's hard to tell whether the political affiliation is what's driving the bus here with respect to Israel, or whether it's a religious thing that's driving the bus. But I do think that it points to an area of division within the Jewish community. So kind of looking at the issue of Israel kind of helps us see the fault lines in the Jewish community as a whole.
Fascinating. Thank you so much, Laura. One of the more interesting findings to me was that those who have more touch points to Jewish life are also those who are more likely to have been to Israel.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you a chicken and egg question. Is it because they have those touch points of Jewish life that they have been to Israel? Or is it because they've been to Israel that they have those touch points to Jewish life? Which came first, the chicken or the egg?
It's a great question. And I, of course, can't give a for sure type of an answer, but I'm going to give you my supposition, which is I think in most cases, it's probably the former, due to the touch points of Jewish life and their pre-existing attachment to Israel. That's why they're going. I'll give you just two quick examples. I used to work in a modern Orthodox yeshiva high school in New York City called SAR High School. And in SAR High School, 90% of the graduates of that school spend a year in Israel after graduation. Even if you were not a kid that would otherwise spend a year in Israel, the peer pressure alone, the sort of school ideology that you would spend a year in Israel sort of pushed you in that direction. So a kid who was growing up in a different kind of community might not have spent that year in Israel, but because of their touch points of the Jewish day school, the community they were living in, they're more likely to go. Summer programs, similarly, across the denominations, students who are very involved with their youth groups of their movements, whether it's NCSY, B'nai Akiva in the Orthodox realm, USY or Ramah in the conservative realm, Nifty in the Reform realm, those kids, they go on trips because that's what their peers do. And they have these organized trips that go along with their movements after 10th grade, after 11th grade, et cetera. And I think that that also gets kids to Israel in a very large part. Having said that, I mean, I think there is no question that the actual trips to Israel do increase attachment to Israel. I'm just going to put in a little teaser here that AJC is coming out with our own set of studies that are going to give color to some of these issues. June 2nd, they will be released, and we have a study of the American Jewish community with respect to education, literacy, and connection to Israel, and about the Israeli community with respect to diaspora literacy, education, and connection. So we'll be able to give you some more actual statistics on that on June 2nd, but my inclination is that, of course, trips to Israel have to increase people's connection to Israel, because being there and seeing it for themselves, of course, makes it a more familiar and more beloved thing.
And of course, studies commissioned by Birthright, by Massa, have indicated that is indeed the case.
Absolutely.
One thing that really sort of struck me about this, and this actually corresponds, I think, very closely to what you just mentioned, our upcoming surveys of American and Israeli Jews on many of these issues, is that Orthodox and Reform American Jews feel that they have more in common with Israelis than they do with one another. It's really quite an astounding finding. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I was very, very struck by that statistic. So I'm just going to give you the numbers so our audience can hear. So 6 in 10 US Jewish adults said they felt they had either a lot in common or some things in common with Jews in Israel. But only 5 in 10 Orthodox Jews said they had either a lot in common or something in common with Reform Jews. And only 4 in 10 Reform Jews said they had a lot in common or some things in common with Orthodox Jews. So what is that about? I mean, you would think that you would have more in common with your fellow American Jews. So I think, I spoke about this a little bit in the People of the Pod podcast on Friday, but I think in some level it's easier to espouse a relationship with Israelis because you don't have to live with them day to day. And also we do see that there's this very, very strong connection among American Jews to Israel writ large. So that probably translates to a general feeling of connection to Israelis as a sort of fuzzy kind of, theoretical group of people that they don't actually have to deal with day to day. We know American Jews better, and therefore perhaps we like them less. Also, just being Israeli, while being different than American, it doesn't really contradict an American Jew's worldview necessarily. Whereas I think Reform and Orthodox ideology and practice are actually much more in conflict with one another. So they pose much more of an ideological challenge, much more of a sort of existential, not existential is not the right word, but an ideological challenge to each other than Israeli Jews would pose to either one of those groups. It's a really interesting statistic.
That is really interesting. And actually, just to sort of, I guess, push you a little bit further on this question, you talk about how in the eyes of at least some American Jews, Israel and Israelis are this theoretical thing several thousand miles away. Do you feel that if American Jews came to understand Israelis and came to really see where they stand on some of these most, very contentious issues on which they may not agree, that might change, that they might actually find that they do have more in common with other American Jews, be they Reform or Orthodox, than they do with Israelis?
Right, you would think that. You would think that maybe if we dug a little deeper and we found, that Israelis differ with us politically or differ with us in terms of the way we see pluralism or denominationalism or those kinds of things, that maybe that would actually distance us further. Interestingly, I actually have found the opposite to be the case as a longtime Israel educator. We actually studied our students at SAR High School, and we studied the more that we kind of taught them about Israelis and about Israeli attitudes, specifically with respect to issues that you would think would distance them, such as pluralism, such as politics, such as the way they view religion and state, for example. The more they learned, the more connected they reported themselves being. So I think that it's interesting to kind of take the theoretical fuzzy Israeli across the ocean that we don't really know that well, and when we make that person real, we're sort of humanizing them and creating a more tight relationship between the two groups. So I would encourage us to actually move in the direction of more knowledge rather than less. I think that actually will end up with closer connections rather than weaker ones.
Well, we at AJC certainly believe in more knowledge rather than less. Let's talk about BDS, which of course is the anti-Israel boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. The findings indicate that many Americans don't even know what BDS is, and amongst those who know, they vastly reject it and have a negative view of it as opposed to those who might have a positive view of that movement. Being that that's the case, why are we so worried about it? Why are so many communal resources pumped into the fight against BDS?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the first thing I would say is BDS is scary. I think that it scares those of us who love Israel, those of us who worry about Israel. It does feel very scary. It very frequently, if not almost always, espouses ideologies that call for the destruction or the end of the state of Israel, which feels particularly frightening and particularly threatening. I think that it is something that causes a lot of anxiety on college campuses in particular. When young Jews come into contact with it, there's a lot of personal attack that goes on where young Jews actually feel sometimes physically threatened, certainly emotionally threatened in college spaces. I think that is also a real issue why we get so worried about it. Obviously, I know we also see that the colleges, there are many of these student councils and student unions that are passing resolutions, BDS resolutions. And even though thus far the universities are not biting and the universities are not divesting from Israel and refusing to do so, sort of ignoring what the students are voting upon, nonetheless, the fact that these votes are taking place are making young Jews in particular feel very uncomfortable, and certainly the organized Jewish community as well. And also, just because Jews don't support it doesn't mean that non-Jews don't. Now, I do wonder what the percentages would be of non-Jews knowing about BDS. I mean, if the Jewish community doesn't really know that much, and the people, by the way, who know the most about BDS in the Jewish community are the Orthodox, right? Because presumably they're the most concerned about Israel, so they delve into the BDS issue the most. So I'm kind of wondering, like, what does the actual general American community know about BDS? I'm guessing probably very little. So I guess all that is to say that I do understand why we're worried about it. And I think we do need to be worried about it, and we do need to combat it. My only caveat would be, I think we need to be careful in our opposition and our fight against BDS to fight it strongly and clearly and emphatically, but not to elevate it. And I'm not exactly sure how you tease out that exact balance. but not to elevate it so much that we're giving it more oxygen than it deserves. I mean, we see that the net support among all Jews, and that includes Jews of no religion, it includes, very disconnected Jews, the net support for BDS in the Jewish community is 10%. Those who strongly support it is 2%. So in terms of our internal Jewish dialogue, we don't want to elevate it so much and give it more oxygen than it deserves, given the really decided lack of support that it has in the Jewish community.
It's interesting. We actually at AJC released our State of Anti-Semitism in America report back in October, which compared American Jewish and general American perspectives on anti-Semitism, experiences and perceptions of anti-Semitism. We asked about that. We asked about BDS, and we actually found that a large majority of Americans in general don't know very much about BDS at all. And those who do know about BDS, the more you knew about BDS, the more you believed it was actually anti-Semitic. So that corresponds very closely to what you just said. And I think that you're definitely right. We shouldn't be pumping any more attention into this very marginal and extreme movement. Let's talk about the two-state solution. This conversation is happening at a very fraught moment. There are still hostilities taking place here in Israel. Rockets are still flying in from Gaza and hitting Israeli cities and towns. But we asked about the two-state solution, or Pew asked about the two-state solution, and what the chances were for a peaceful resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And what we found is that actually there's a great deal of optimism amongst the American Jewish community about the prospects of Israeli-Palestinian peace, with one exception. That exception is the Orthodox. The Orthodox were decidedly pessimistic about the prospects of an established two-state solution between Israel and the Palestinians. Why do you suppose that is?
Yeah, I thought that was a really interesting statistic. So I think that, first of all, I think the Orthodox, attitude toward the two-state solution probably more closely matches the way Israelis think about the two-state solution, and by the way, probably Palestinians as well, which is there's much more pessimism on the ground in Israel than there is sort of from 6,000 miles away or 30,000 feet up, so to speak. I think that, Israelis are living in the very complex situation, the day-to-day situation there, which makes it feel much more daunting to achieve a two-state solution. Americans, are living very far away. I'm going to get to the Orthodox in a minute. I haven't forgotten that was actually a question, but I'm sort of framing it with Israelis and Americans first. Americans are far away. Americans tend to be optimistic in general. Americans think that they can solve problems. Americans think that they can particularly fix intergroup relations types of things. So I think that all of those things sort of militate toward a general American attitude of being more optimistic about the two-state solution. But the Orthodox are kind of a separate category there. So for a couple of reasons. First of all, we know that Orthodox Jews go to Israel a lot more often. They are more connected to Israel in general. They are watching and following the news much more about Israel. Orthodox Jews, 70% of them follow the news. This is according to the Pew study, follow the news very or somewhat closely, and 32% of them closely. It was by far, Orthodox Jews follow the news about Israel closely, by far more than any other group. They're much more aware of the nuances. They're much more aware of how daunting the actual situation is. So I think that Orthodox Jews, because they're so invested in Israel, because they go to Israel so much, because they're more knowledgeable about Israel, because they read more about Israel, they may be just more clear on the complexities of what would be involved with the two-state solution. I also want to add one other piece of the puzzle with Orthodox Jews, which is that Orthodox Jews have much more religiously invested in sort of a greater land of Israel and some of the territories that may be given up to a Palestinian state and a two-state solution. Some of those territories are particularly religiously important to many Orthodox Jews. So Hebron, for example, Kiryat Arba, some of the biblical lands that are very, very important in our biblical foundational stories. Orthodox Jews reported in the Pew study that 87% of them believe that God gave the land that is now Israel to the Jewish people. And that number was more than double what conservative Jews felt and more than triple what Reform Jews felt. So the concept of a two-state solution is just more loaded, I think, for Orthodox Jews who feel much more of a sense of loss at some of the territories that would probably become a Palestinian state and a two-state solution that are religiously very significant and emotionally very significant for them. So I think that also has to be part of the mix as well.
Fascinating. Laura, that was really quite remarkable. In looking at all of that, everything we've discussed and everything that you have digested from this incredibly important report, courtesy of Pew, What are the takeaways for us at AJC? How does this impact our work?
Great. That is definitely the $64,000 question. So I want to start by saying that AJC's philosophy and my personal philosophy about Israel diaspora relations and keeping that relationship strong, we have long believed and continue to believe that there are two components that are key. The first component is that we have to have strong education about one another. That education piece is key, and we see it, right? Even in the Pew statistics, those who tend to be more educated about Israel are more connected. And we don't know if there's a chicken and egg piece there. It's more complicated, but certainly they are together. Those groups hang together. And the second piece is a relationship building, and both are critical. Those are both very, very critical components. We need to not only learn about each other, but we also need to know one another. So I'm gonna that's kind of my overarching, my umbrella statement about it. To delve a little bit deeper, I wanted to get back to what Alan was talking about with respect to younger Jews and what we kind of touched on a little bit earlier. We need to think carefully about what are the reasons for younger Jews straying from Israel. And I'll just note, because we're talking a lot about the differences between Orthodox and liberal movement Jews, I actually asked the Pew folks about whether young Orthodox Jews are also distancing in the same numbers, but the sample of Orthodox Jews is too small for Pew to be able to accurately tease that out. Orthodox Jews are about 10% of the American Jewish population, so it's too small of a number for them to tease out whether young Orthodox Jews are also distancing from Israel as well. They say they're going to be posting their statistics, their data sets on the website in the next few months, and we'll be able to delve into it ourselves. I'm looking forward to that. But so I'm just going to leave that one aside because we don't really have information on that. But we do have to think about how to keep younger Jews in general, whether they're Orthodox or conservative or Reform or Jews of no religion or non-denominational, connected to Israel. And I think that there's a lot that goes into that. I think we need to be very careful to listen to younger Jews. We have to hear their questions. We have to hear their concerns. I would add to Alan's sort of list of things that may be explaining the distancing. The fact that, if we put them in historical context, younger Jews don't remember an Israel that is under existential threat. I mean, of course, if Iran drops a nuclear bomb on Israel, that's an existential threat. But what they don't remember is 1973. I mean, I don't remember 1973. And they don't remember 1967. They don't remember these moments when it was possible that Israel was going to be wiped off the face of the map by a war within days or within hours. And they also don't have the same sense of danger for Jews around the world as those of us who grew up with Holocaust survivors who were young and vibrant and in our lives at all times. Holocaust survivors are very old and fragile now. Most of our young people have heard from them, but not all of them. And we know that in the coming years, that is sadly going to end. So this whole kind of notion of crisis, the notion that either Israel is in crisis or the Jewish people is in crisis, both of which were strong components of a connection to Israel in earlier generations, those two pieces are not as resonant, I believe, for younger Jews. And I've been teaching younger Jews about Israel and trying to sort of build that connection for 2 decades. So I think I have somewhat of a good sense of it. Of course, I'm only one person and I've only come into contact with a limited number of young people. But I do think that that's the case. Those narratives don't speak to their reality. So I think that we really need to make the case that Israel is central to Jewish history, central to Jewish identity, central to Jewish peoplehood, and just an incredibly exciting, vibrant, alive democracy that has so much to contribute, not just to the Jewish people, to the world. So I think that we need to have a positive cast when we're talking to young people. The one last thing I want to say about young people is I think that we as the organized Jewish community, we are very wary of allowing young Jews or any people to express any kind of disagreement with Israel publicly. That is something that is of my generation. It's of the generation older than I am. And I think that young people don't look at the world that way. They're very happy to criticize the American government. I mean, I think we all are at various points, but they don't, for them, criticizing the Israeli government publicly does not mean that they don't love Israel. It's just that's the way they operate. And again, that's something that has been studied as well by various studies that have shown that a complex narrative about Israel actually increases connection among young Jews. It does not decrease it. So I think that's something that the organized Jewish community has to take on. We need to be better about allowing nuanced conversations about Israel to take place under our big tent of organized Jewish communal life. Speaking of big tents, I just wanted to also say that we have to be careful about bringing in all sectors of the Jewish community that have not necessarily been involved in AJC's work. Particularly, I'm thinking about the modern Orthodox community. I think we have so much overlap in terms of our passion for Israel, our connection to Israel, and the modern Orthodox community's passion and connection to Israel. There's much that we can do together. We have to continue to be a big tent that way. And lastly, I'll just say that we need to continue to be a big tent with respect to political outlook. AJC's bipartisan and nonpartisan stance, to me, has never been more critical. It's always critical, but it's never been more critical. And we see that in this survey that we really need to have places for people to express their Zionism and express their connection to Israel and their passion for Israel, no matter what political allegiance they have. So I think that we need to continue to espouse that very, very careful, moderate, bipartisan / nonpartisan stance.
All I can say is amen to everything you just said. sign on the dotted line, every single thing that you just mentioned. And I do want to give one more plug for our upcoming surveys of American and Israeli Jews on these subjects. I know that, Laura, you've worked so hard on these surveys, and they have some really rich findings. We're looking forward to unveiling those in the next few weeks. And with that, Daniel, over to you.
Avi and Laura, thank you so much. I'd like to bring Becca and Alan back on as well for the Q&A portion. And we have a lot of questions that have come in. And Becca, maybe I'll start with you since you're now here. From Lev Levicius on Zoom asks, have you looked at the differences between different immigrant communities? So for example, the Syrian, Bukhari, Iranian, former Soviet Union, et cetera, here in the United States when doing your research?
So we did ask a question about, what country were you born in? Where are your parents born? Unfortunately, we haven't really dug into that. Most Jews are born in the US. And so there definitely be sample size issues in terms of analyzing specific groups. If I remember correctly, I want to say, actually, let me just take a quick look. Yeah, so 90% of our respondents were born in the US. So to look individually at any one of those groups would really not be possible for us, unfortunately.
Thank you. Our next question comes from A. Baker Butler, an incoming college student, and this is for you, Laura. Laura, it seems counterintuitive that religious observance among young Jews was so high, near that of older Jews. To what do you attribute this, and do you think it has anything to do with the pandemic?
That's interesting. To my understanding, and Alan and Becca, maybe you can weigh in on this. I believe the survey took place before the pandemic, maybe somewhat into the pandemic. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. Mostly it was conducted prior. It was entirely conceived and mostly conducted prior to the pandemic.
Yeah.
3/4 of the responses came in prior to March 15th, 2020.
So it's a great question, Abe. I think that what I would say is that I do think there is a hunger for connection to the Jewish community among young Jews. I think that they want to do it on their terms. I think that they may conceive of rituals and traditions in ways different than older generations, as every young generation does. That's what keeps our community vibrant and alive and growing. But I do see that in my work with young Jews. Again, I've been working with young Jews for 20 years or more, that there is a real hunger for connection to the Jewish community, and they do find deep meaning in the Jewish community. I think that the difference between the young Jews and young Americans in general that Alan mentioned tend to be distancing from religion. I think that, in my mind at least, what that's attributable to is that Judaism doesn't only play out as a religion for young Jews in America or for any Jews in America. It plays out also as a culture, as a history, as a tradition, as a people. And people want to belong to things. People want to feel connected. They want to feel connected to their heritage, to their past, to their ancestry, et cetera. And I think that for many young Jews, the way those traditions play out may be more linked in their minds to sort of communal connection, peoplehood connection, cultural connections than to religious connection. And that may be the reason that it's different than other young Americans in terms of distancing from religion.
Thank you. Our next question, and I'll address this to you, Alan, comes from Lana Zeller in Dallas, Texas. Can you tell us more about how you ensure a representative and unbiased sample of the American Jewish community?
Sure. Thank you for the question. In the report, there is a lengthy methodology that will go into much greater detail than I'm going to. But I think the key thing to understand is that this survey does not start with any kinds of lists of American Jews. We don't start out looking for people who have Jewish sounding names or anything like that. We start with a massive survey of the general public. So as Becca indicated right at the beginning, we take the US Postal Service's list of all the residential addresses in the United States, and we randomly select from that list, and we send letters. We put $1 bill or $2 bills in those initial letters just as a kind of trust building measure. People get the letter and it says, would you please take a brief survey, and they can do it either on paper and pencil and mail it back to us in an addressed envelope, or they can go online with a special number that they enter in a secure website. And in either case, we then administer a brief screening survey, and that survey contains a variety of questions, but some of them are questions that help us to identify people who consider themselves Jewish in any way. And so for this survey, actually, the survey interviewed 68,000. That's a very large sample for a survey. It's why these things are so expensive, complicated, and don't tend to take place very often. We interviewed 68,000 Americans, not Jews, across the country. Now we sent more letters in some areas, like the greater New York area where more Jews live, and we account for that then in the weighting. So everybody is represented proportional to their actual share of the population. And with the screening survey, we then administer an extended survey to anybody who considers themselves Jewish in any way. And then for analytical purposes, we have to have a more narrow definition of who counts as Jewish. We can go into that. You can read all about that in the report. But both the broader sample, the 68,000, is weighted to be representative of the US population in line with census statistics. So it's weighted in terms of age, gender, education levels, region of the country, and a variety of other variables, demographic variables, to be representative of the broader US population. And then the Jewish population subgroup is also weighted in a complicated way through modeling to be representative of the Jewish population as a whole. And furthermore, our numbers line up very well with previous surveys and with other studies that have used different methodologies for estimating the number of Jews in the United States and the characteristics of Jews in the United States. So overall, we could have about as much confidence in these data as representative of Jews as a whole as we could have in any data set. That being said, of course, there are potential sources of bias, and it's always important to look at surveys and be aware that there are margins of sampling error and also issues with the question wording and so on, all of which can introduce uncertainty or bias into the results. Thank you for the good question.
Thank you, Alan. And we're running short on time. So I want to ask Laura, I want to ask you one more question, and perhaps Becca or Alan, if you'd like to jump in as well. There's several parts to the question, but it comes from Felice Stanley in Providence, Rhode Island, who asked, it appeared that there were trends along the observance spectrum for type of anti-Semitism experience, with Reform Jews more likely to experience anti-Semitism about Jews being greedy, and Orthodox Jews more likely to experience dual loyalty accusations. To what do you attribute this to? Do you think this has to do with Orthodox Jews being visibly Jewish and or seen as more likely to support Israel? Or are people saying anti-Semitic things in front of Reform Jews that they wouldn't say in front of people who are visibly Jewish? Can you speak to that a little bit, Laura?
Sure. So I would say that Reform Jews have a very different sort of visible face in society than Orthodox Jews. And I think that's the person who asked the question is kind of alluding to that in the question itself. Orthodox Jews are more separate and apart from American society as a whole than Reform Jews, who tend to be quite integrated into American society and don't necessarily look in any way different or behave in any way different. They don't necessarily wear external sort of Jewish accoutrements like a kippah, yarmulke on their head. They might wear, some jewelry, a Jewish star necklace or something like that. But in general, they don't really look any different than than other Americans. So the anti-Semitism exists no matter what, right? The society has anti-Semitism. We see that it is, certainly Jews are very concerned about its growth in America. I think that anti-Semitism is based in conspiracy theories, and the conspiracy theories, they try to hang those conspiracy theories, whether consciously or unconsciously, on hooks that make the most sense so that they can survive, spread, and flourish. So attacking Orthodox Jews who are so visibly Jewish with the label of dual loyalty makes much more sense. Orthodox Jews also particularly ultra-Orthodox Jews tend to not be as wealthy. They're not as integrated in terms of working in the finance sector as other Jews might be. So attacking them on the sort of finance basis doesn't make as much sense. It's not going to be as successful an anti-Semitic claim as it might be in the Reform Jewish community, where they have jobs just like any other American has jobs. They work in the finance sector, they work in law, they work in banking, just like other Americans do. They're much less likely to sort of look different and behave different to sort of underpin accusations of dual loyalty.
Thank you, Laura. And since we are running out of time, before we conclude, Becca, if you can just let our audience know again where the report can be found. I do know we've also received a lot of questions asking if the slides can be made available. So any light you can share on that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. Everything we talked about is available on our website. If you just go to pewresearch.org/Jewish Americans, you can find it. There's, as Alan said, a literally 248-page report, which includes an extensive appendix about how we did the survey, an extensive appendix about why we can or can't trend some questions from 2013. It includes a link to an FAQ, commonly asked questions, some of which you're raising. It includes every question we asked. It includes a top line of the results. There's a lot out there. So I just say, go to the website, click around. There's also actually an interactive if you want to participate in the experience of taking some of the questions from our survey. It's also linked on that same site. So there's lots available already, even if not the data set, that you just check out on our site.
Thank you, Becca and Alan. Thank you, Laura, Avi. Thank the four of you for joining us today and for presenting this data. I know our audience truly appreciates it. And Becca just mentioned where you can find the report. And I should also add that for those of you who wish to stay up to date on the most pressing issues facing Israel, the Jewish people, and the world, please follow AJC on Twitter or Facebook by searching AJC Global or visiting us at ajc.org. Thank you again to our entire audience, our panelists, for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you.